The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the barren hills as the small town of San Juan stood in the late afternoon heat. Dust swirled in the air, clinging to everything it touched. The town, nestled in the heart of Texas, was a place where every man and woman had a story of struggle, and each story was just as harsh as the land they worked. Among them was Jack McAllister, a rancher whose life had been nothing short of a battle. His ranch, once a thriving stretch of land, had been slowly suffocating under the weight of drought and poor harvests. For the past few years, Jack's cattle had grown thin, and his crops barely managed to survive the dry spells. His debts were piling up, and he found himself spending most nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling of his small ranch house, wondering how much longer he could hold on. Today, he stood at the entrance of the local auction house, his heart beating faster than usual. The town had gathered for the annual cattle auction, a time when ranchers came together to buy and sell livestock, hoping to make a little money or at least break even. But this year, something unusual was going to happen. For reasons Jack didn't fully understand, a young woman was being auctioned off, Mary Ellis, the daughter of a neighboring rancher who had recently passed away. Jack had heard the whispers around town. Mary's father had been a good man, but after his death, the ranch had gone into foreclosure. With no family left, Mary had become a commodity, something to be sold to the highest bidder in exchange for security, or at least a roof over her head. The town was buzzing with the unusual spectacle. No one could quite believe it, and some even called it wrong. But the auction was scheduled, and Mary Ellis was to be sold. As Jack made his way into the crowded barn, he felt a strange unease. He wasn't sure why the situation affected him so much. He didn't know Mary. She was just a girl, barely 19, with no future. Yet there was something about her face that stayed with him, even before the auction began. She was standing by the side of the auctioneer, her head slightly lowered, her eyes scanning the ground. Her hands were folded in front of her, and she looked as though she had resigned herself to her fate. Jack had seen her once or twice from a distance, but they had never spoken. From what he knew, she was quiet and shy, with the kind of innocence that made you want to protect her from the cruel realities of the world. And yet here she was, about to be sold, her future hanging in the balance. The auctioneer stood up, tapping his gavel to get everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, today's auction is a bit different. As you all know, we're not just selling cattle today. We also have a young lady, Mary Ellis, up for bid. She's a hard-working girl, and with her, you'll have a strong partner for whatever you need. The auctioneer's voice was sharp, but there was a slight hesitation in his tone. He too seemed to feel the awkwardness of the situation. Let's begin. The starting bid is $100. Who will give me $100 for the girl? Jack didn't even think twice. His hand shot up, and the other bidders looked at him with raised eyebrows. There were murmurs among the crowd, some people clearly disapproving of the situation, while others just seemed curious. But Jack didn't care. He needed to do something, anything. His ranch was on the edge of failure, and Mary Ellis, strange as it sounded, might be the answer. The auctioneer's eyes flickered to Jack, and a smile spread across his face. "We have $100 from Mr. McAllister. Who will bid $150? He called out. Jack didn't wait for the bid to rise. He raised his hand again, his mind focused on the problem at hand: survival. His ranch, his cattle, and even his own peace of mind depended on him making this work. He had a rough plan in mind, and in that plan a wife might just be what he needed. Not for love, at least not at first, but as a partner in a world that was too difficult to navigate alone. The auctioneer paused, eyeing the crowd. "200? He asked. The bids climbed slowly. Jack could feel the pressure in the air, the tension among the other ranchers. Some of them had laughed at the idea of bidding for a woman, but Jack had made up his mind. By the time the price reached $500, he could see some of the other bidders backing down. Maybe they thought it wasn't worth it. Maybe they were uncomfortable. But Jack wasn't. His hand shot up again. $750, he called out firmly. The crowd went silent. Everyone turned to look at him. The auctioneer's eyes widened, and he adjusted his glasses. $750 from Mr. McAllister. Who will go $800? Jack's heart pounded in his chest. His eyes never left Mary. She was standing quietly as though this was all just a part of her life now. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look angry. She just looked resigned. $800. Someone finally called from the back of the room. But Jack wasn't going to let this go. His hand shot up once more. $1,000. The auctioneer raised his gavel, glancing over the room. The bids had stopped. There were no more hands raised. Jack McAllister had won. The gavel fell. Sold to Mr. McAllister for $1,000. The murmurs from the crowd were louder this time. Jack felt a knot in his stomach. He had just bought a woman, a young girl, and for a moment he wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into. But before he could fully process it, the auctioneer motioned for him to come forward. "Mr. McAllister, please come up to claim your purchase near," the auctioneer said with a slight bow. Jack stood up slowly, wiping the sweat from his brow. His legs felt shaky as he made his way toward the stage where Mary stood. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "Mary," Jack said, his voice softer than he intended. I guess this is it." Mary gave him a small nod, and for the first time Jack saw the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. It wasn't much, but it was there, and somehow it made him feel a little better. As he led her out of the auction house, Jack didn't know what the future would hold. All he knew was that this strange, unexpected turn of events had put them both on a path they had never imagined. And as the sun sank lower in the sky, Jack couldn't help but feel that in some way this might just be the start of something new, the end of one life and the beginning of another. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden light over the land as Jack McAllister led Mary Ellis away from the auction house. The air was thick with the heat of late afternoon, and the dust from the auction still hung in the air, as if clinging to the strange situation that had just unfolded. Jack walked with quick, purposeful steps, trying to keep his mind from spinning. He had bought a young woman at an auction, and now he had to figure out what to do next. Mary walked beside him, her footsteps quiet, her eyes focused on the ground. There was something about the way she held herself that suggested she had given up trying to fight the harsh world she found herself in. She hadn't said much since the auction ended, and Jack wasn't sure if it was because she was shocked or simply because she didn't know how to feel. As they reached the edge of town, Jack glanced at her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough from the dust in the air. Mary looked up, her face still unreadable. She nodded slowly, but the flicker of sadness in her eyes didn't escape Jack's notice. She had been through so much already, losing her father, her family's ranch, and now being sold at auction like livestock. Jack could only imagine how it must have felt for her. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be all right." Jack wasn't sure whether he believed her, but he didn't press the issue. They were already nearing the small farmhouse that Jack called home. It wasn't much, just a modest building with a few outbuildings scattered around the property. The land was parched and dry, and Jack had barely managed to keep the cattle alive during the last few years of drought. But it was home, and at least it offered some shelter from the harsh winds that often swept across the plains. When they reached the house, Jack paused and turned to Mary. "This is where you'll be staying. It's not much, but it's all I've got." Mary took in the view of the farmhouse, her gaze drifting over the weathered wooden walls and the overgrown yard. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded as if taking in the new reality that had been thrust upon her. Jack shifted uneasily. "I know this is all strange, all of this," he said, motioning toward the house and then back to Mary. "But I need help. The ranch is struggling and I can't do it alone. I'm offering you a place to stay, and in return you'll be able to help me work the land. It's a fair deal. You get food, shelter, and a chance to start over. And I get a hand with the ranch." Mary didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at Jack with something like curiosity. It wasn't anger or fear, just quiet understanding. "So you're saying I work for you?" Jack hesitated. He wasn't exactly sure how to explain it. "Not just work for me. We'll be partners," he said, his voice steady but unsure. "This land needs both of us to make it through. We'll be equals in this, not just employer and employee." Mary didn't speak for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Then, almost as if accepting the strange twist her life had taken, she finally spoke. "What do you expect from me, then? Just work?" Jack sighed and scratched the back of his neck. He had to be honest with her. He had no other option. "I need more than just help, Mary. This is going to sound strange, but I need you to marry me. We'll need to be married for legal reasons, and if I'm honest, it might make things easier for both of us." The words hung in the air between them like a strange, heavy cloud. Jack could see the surprise in Mary's eyes, and for a moment, he wondered if he had gone too far. But as he looked at her, he could see that there was no judgment, only a quiet acceptance. Maybe it was because she knew that this world they lived in wasn't kind to women like her. Maybe it was because she had no other choice. "You want to marry me?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost incredulous. Jack nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "It's not for love, at least not yet. It's for survival. You help me with the ranch, and I help you with, well, everything else. It's a business deal in a way. We both need each other, and we're both stuck in a situation where neither of us has much choice." Mary considered his words, her eyes searching Jack's face for any hint of deception. But all she saw was sincerity. He was a man of few words, and in his eyes she saw nothing but exhaustion. He wasn't asking for love. He was asking for a partnership, a way to survive. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, Mary nodded. "All right, I'll marry you. But I need to know that I'm not just some sort of possession to you." "I'm not a prize you bought," Jack shook his head quickly. "No, that's not it at all. You're not a possession. I'm just trying to make sure we both have a chance at something better. We're in this together whether we like it or not." Mary gave him a small smile. "Well, I guess we'll see if that's true." The decision had been made, and as strange as it was, Jack felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had a plan now, something that felt at least a little more solid than what he had before, but it wasn't going to be easy. The work was grueling, and the land wouldn't give up its bounty easily. And yet, as the evening sun bathed the land in a soft golden light, Jack couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had taken the first step, however strange it may have seemed, and now they would build something from the dust together. As the night fell, they stood side by side, looking out over the ranch. In that moment, neither of them knew exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, both Jack and Mary felt like they had a chance. Together. As the days passed, the air between Jack and Mary grew thicker with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Their marriage, though not born of romance, had begun to feel like something more. A bond forged out of necessity, but still a bond. In the quiet moments between work, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the evening air grew cooler, they would share small glances, brief words, but mostly silence. The silence was comfortable in its own way, as if they had both accepted that this was the life they had now, and it was up to them to make the best of it. The ranch was slowly coming to life again. Jack and Mary spent long days working together, repairing fences, tending to the few cattle Jack still had, and preparing the land for whatever crops might survive the drought. There was no magic formula, no secret that would suddenly make everything easy again. They worked hard side by side, learning the rhythm of the land and the unspoken language of each other's efforts. Jack was used to hard work, but he had never had anyone to share the load with, certainly not someone like Mary. He had been a lone wolf for so long, pushing himself harder than most could imagine just to keep his ranch running. But Mary's quiet strength, her calm persistence in the face of exhaustion, had begun to change him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close. They were two souls trying to survive in a harsh world, and in the harshness they found a kind of respect. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jack called Mary over to the porch of their modest farmhouse. It was a cool evening, with the last traces of sunlight stretching across the dry land. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, a beautiful contrast to the cracked earth below. Jack stood there for a moment, looking out at the horizon, unsure how to begin. His heart felt heavy, and a strange anxiety crept up on him. He had already asked Mary to marry him once, but today it felt like something different, something more serious. "Mary," Jack began, his voice deep and steady, "we need to get this over with. I know it's been a lot to take in. I've thought about it, and we both need this for things to be official. The land, the ranch, even everything we've been doing here, it'll be easier if we're legally married. We need to make it official." Mary looked at him, her face soft but unreadable. She had always been patient, even in moments of uncertainty, and Jack admired that about her. For a moment, they both just stood there, the cool breeze flowing around them, the sounds of the ranch, the distant calls of cattle, the rustling of the wind through the trees filled the quiet. But then Jack noticed the slight shift in her posture, a sign that she was taking him seriously. "I agree," Mary said quietly, "but it feels strange, you know. I mean, we're doing this to survive, not because we have any choice. But I suppose it's better than the alternative, isn't it? Jack nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He had no grand proposal in mind, no fancy ceremony to offer her. All he could give was this small, dust-choked ranch and the promise of a future built from the ground up. But as strange as it seemed, it felt right. Two people bound together by necessity, but also by the unspoken bond of shared effort. We don't need anything fancy. Just a simple ceremony, Jack said, his voice rough. The preacher from the church in town is around today. We can do it before the sun sets. Mary looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time that day, her gaze warm but steady. She didn't need grand gestures either. All she needed was stability, something she hadn't known in a long time. And strange as it was, Jack offered her that. In his quiet way, he had given her a place, a home, a life that was hers to build alongside his. "We'll do it," she said softly. "Let's get married." And just like that, the decision was made. They would marry, not for love, but for the promise of a future they would create together. The next hour was a whirlwind. Jack quickly went to fetch the preacher, who had been passing through the area, and they met in the small clearing near the barn, where the last golden rays of sunlight danced on the dry earth. It wasn't much, but it was all they needed. The preacher, an older man with a kind face, stood ready with his Bible in hand, and Jack and Mary stood beside him, their eyes locked on each other in silent understanding. As the preacher began to speak, the wind kicked up a little, swirling the dust in the air. It was a simple ceremony with no guests, no decorations, and no music, just the sound of the preacher's voice, the soft rustle of the wind, and the quiet, steady beat of the land beneath their feet. Jack turned to Mary, his voice steady, but filled with something deeper. "I, Jack McAllister, take you, Mary Ellis, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand by you, to work alongside you, and to build a life together, not because I have to, but because you are the one I've chosen to share this life with." Mary's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of years spent searching for something solid, something real. "I, Mary Ellis, take you, Jack McAllister, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to work with you, to stand by you, and to face the challenges of this life with you, no matter what." The preacher smiled kindly, then said, "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." It wasn't a grand kiss, no passionate display of affection. It was a simple, quick kiss, shared between two people who had just committed themselves to one another, not out of love, but out of something perhaps stronger, mutual respect and the shared goal of survival. As they pulled apart, Jack felt a strange sense of relief. The deed was done. They were married, and in that moment it felt like something had shifted between them. It wasn't the start of a love story, not yet, but it was the start of something. They had taken the first step toward building something together. As the preacher left, Jack and Mary stood in the quiet of the evening, the sun dipping lower into the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. The ranch, still parched and struggling, stretched out before them. But now it wasn't just Jack's ranch, it was theirs. Together they would face the hardships ahead side by side. The wind kicked up once more, swirling the dust around them, but this time it didn't seem as harsh. It was just a reminder of the land that they were both tied to now. A reminder that no matter how difficult things might get, they would be in it together. "Let's get to work," Jack said, his voice steady, his eyes glinting with something new. Hope, perhaps. "We've got a lot to do." Mary smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Together," she replied, her voice soft but strong, and with that, they turned toward the house, ready to face the challenges of the future, together. The days following their simple wedding ceremony were filled with the steady rhythm of farm life. Jack and Mary worked side by side, their bond slowly growing stronger as the land they toiled on began to show signs of life. It wasn't easy. The drought hadn't disappeared, and the land still felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for a sign of promise. But there was something about the way they worked together that made the heavy lifting, the long hours and the sweat-soaked days seem more manageable. Mary was not a stranger to hard work. She had grown up on a ranch, and though she had never been in charge of the day-to-day operations, she had learned enough from her father to help Jack with the ranch chores. She was quick to catch on to the rhythm of the work, feeding the few cattle that Jack had left, mending fences, and learning how to deal with the old tractor that had seen better days. At first, Jack had done most of the work himself, feeling hesitant to ask for help. But Mary's quiet determination soon proved invaluable. She had a sharp eye for details, and she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Jack found himself relying on her more and more each day. It wasn't just that she knew what needed to be done. It was the way she did it, with a sense of calm, without complaint, and with a certain grace that made everything seem a little bit easier. There were still days when they would clash, small arguments about how to handle a stubborn cow or where to plant the crops. But those moments were short-lived, and each time they found themselves at odds, they quickly realized that they were both working toward the same goal: survival. One afternoon, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, Jack and Mary sat on the porch of the farmhouse, their tired bodies resting after a long day in the fields. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the warm evening breeze made the dust seem less oppressive. Jack looked over at Mary, her face bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and for the first time since their marriage, he realized just how much he had come to rely on her. "You've made this place feel different," Jack said, his voice low. "It's not the same as before. It's like I'm not doing this alone anymore." Mary looked over at him, her eyes soft. "We're in this together, Jack. It's not just you anymore. We both have a stake in this place." It was simple, but those words meant more to Jack than he could say. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the weight of the world was on his shoulders alone. There was someone else beside him, someone who understood the struggles of the land and was willing to put in the work to make it survive. "We're making progress," Mary added, her tone thoughtful. "The crops are coming along and the cattle seem to be getting stronger. Maybe things aren't as bad as they seem." Jack nodded, though a small knot of worry still sat in his stomach. The rains had been scarce, and even with all their hard work, there was no guarantee that they would make it through the year. But Mary's optimism was contagious, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The next few weeks brought more hard work and even more quiet moments between the two of them. They fell into a routine. Mornings spent feeding the animals and checking the fences, afternoons spent working on the land, and evenings spent together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and for Jack, that was enough. One morning, as Jack worked in the barn, he noticed Mary standing by the old tractor, her hands resting on her hips as she stared out across the land. He walked over to her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You all right?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. Mary turned to him, her face thoughtful. "I was just thinking," she said quietly. "We've been working hard, but it feels like we're still missing something. The land is giving us some promise, but it's not enough. Maybe we should think about bringing in some help, someone to help with the planting or the cattle." Jack frowned slightly. He hadn't wanted to ask for help. He had always been the one who shouldered the burden of the ranch, and it felt like admitting weakness to ask for assistance. But he could see the logic in Mary's words. The work was too much for just the two of them. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I've always tried to do it on my own. But if you think it might help..." Mary smiled at him, a small but genuine smile. "It's not about doing it alone, Jack. It's about doing it together. We both want the same thing, and we can't do it all by ourselves." Jack hesitated, then nodded. He knew she was right. There was no shame in asking for help, not when survival was at stake. That afternoon, Jack and Mary made the decision to hire a few local hands, 2 young men from a neighboring ranch who had experience working cattle and fixing fences. They agreed to come for a trial period, and Jack felt a strange sense of relief as they worked alongside him and Mary in the days that followed. It wasn't long before Jack realized just how much of a difference the extra help made. The tasks that had seemed overwhelming before now felt manageable. The cattle were tended to more carefully, the fences were fixed with precision, and the crops were getting the attention they needed. The ranch, though still struggling, was starting to show signs of life in ways that Jack hadn't thought possible. As the weeks passed, the young men continued to work with Jack and Mary, and a new sense of community began to develop on the ranch. The labor was hard, but it was shared, and that made all the difference. Jack found himself spending less time worrying about every little detail and more time focusing on the bigger picture, keeping the ranch alive, keeping the animals healthy, and keeping Mary by his side. One evening, as they all sat together at the dinner table, enjoying a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Jack looked around at the small group, Mary, the young hands, and himself. It was nothing like the grand dinners he had imagined when he was younger, but it was something more. It was a team working together toward a common goal. It was a family of sorts. "Things are looking up," Jack said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We've still got a long way to go, but we're making it happen, together." Mary smiled at him, her eyes warm with appreciation. "We're building something, Jack, and that's more than I could have hoped for." As the evening wore on and the stars began to appear in the sky above, Jack realized something he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the land that was thriving again, it was their partnership. It had started out as a way to survive, but now, it was turning into something more than either of them had imagined. And in that quiet moment, with the stars overhead and the warm light of the fire casting shadows on the walls, Jack knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Mary would face them together, to be continued. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as Jack McAllister sat on the porch of his farmhouse, watching the quiet of the evening settle over the ranch. The breeze was soft, carrying with it the scent of the earth that had once felt like a heavy burden, but now seemed to breathe life into everything around him. He looked out at the fields where the crops had begun to show promise, and the cattle that had grown strong and healthy under the care of both him and Mary. It had been a year since that strange day when he had bought Mary at the auction, a year since their hurried wedding, and a year since their lives had been forever changed. The land wasn't yet thriving, but it was no longer on the brink of collapse either. There was hope. And that, more than anything, had made all the difference. As Jack sat, he noticed Mary coming toward him, her figure silhouetted against the fading light of the day. She had just finished feeding the animals, and her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, strands of it flying in the breeze. There was a quiet strength about her now, the kind that only comes from working with the land and facing hardship together. Jack smiled as she sat down beside him, her eyes reflecting the calmness of the evening sky. They had spent so much time together in the past year, working side by side, that they had begun to understand each other in ways words couldn't explain. They didn't need to talk all the time. They had built a life out of hard work, small gestures, and a mutual respect that had turned into something more. A bond that had deepened with every sunrise. "How's the Westfield?" Jack asked, turning toward her. Mary smiled, her eyes softening. "It's looking good. The crops are growing strong and the rain's been decent. I think it'll be a good harvest this year." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of the past few years begin to lift from his shoulders. There had been so many times when he thought he couldn't hold on anymore, when he thought the ranch was going to be lost for good. But now things were different. The land was responding to their hard work, and there was hope that they might make it through the next few years. "I've been thinking," Jack began, his voice low and thoughtful. "It's been a year since we got married, and when I think about everything that's happened, I can't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the work, for the land, and most of all for you." Mary looked at him, her face lighting up with a gentle smile. "You know, I've been thinking the same thing. When I first came here, I had no idea what the future would hold. I didn't expect much, but I didn't expect this either. I didn't expect us to build something real together." Jack's heart stirred as he listened to her words. She had come to him with nothing, just a quiet determination and a will to survive. But in that time, she had become something much more. She was his partner, his equal, and in many ways she had become the heart of the ranch. He realized now with certainty that it wasn't just the land that had been transformed. It was their relationship. What had started out as an arrangement for survival had grown into something deep, something genuine. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak words that had been on his mind for a while. "Mary, I know when we got married it wasn't for love. At least not the kind of love people talk about. But it's different now. I care about you, more than I ever thought I could care about anyone. This ranch, this life, it's all better because you're here. And I think I love you." Mary's eyes softened, her hand gently reaching for his. "I think I love you too, Jack." The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything they had been through. A year ago they had barely known each other, bound together by a strange twist of fate. Now they had built something that felt solid, something that felt right. Their relationship had grown from a business arrangement into something deeper, a true partnership. The two sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the whisper of the wind and the distant call of the cattle. It was as if the world around them had paused, giving them the space to just be together, to reflect on the journey they had made. In that quiet moment, Jack realized that the future didn't seem as uncertain as it once had. They had come this far together, and as long as they stayed side by side, there was no challenge they couldn't face. The sun had nearly set, the sky now painted in deep purples and reds. Jack stood up, offering his hand to Mary. "Come on, let's take a walk." Mary smiled, accepting his hand, and together they walked toward the edge of the property, the soft crunch of the earth beneath their boots the only sound breaking the silence. The field stretched out before them, bathed in the fading light. It was peaceful, almost like a dream. Jack squeezed her hand as they walked, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. They had come so far from the harshness of the auction house to this, their land, their home, their life. There was still much to be done. The ranch wasn't perfect, and there would always be more work to do. But that was okay, because they were doing it together. As they reached the top of the hill, Jack stopped and turned to face Mary. The last rays of the sun bathed her in a golden light, and for a moment she looked like something out of a dream. Strong, beautiful, and full of life. Jack felt a surge of love for her, not the kind of love that comes easily, but the kind that builds over time, through shared effort and quiet moments of understanding. He took a deep breath, his heart full. "You know, I used to think I could do this all alone. That I had to, but now I can't imagine doing it without you." Mary smiled, her eyes shining in the last of the daylight. "I couldn't imagine doing it without you either." They stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the past year pressing down on them, but in a way that felt freeing, not heavy. They had survived the hardest of times, and now, with each other, they were starting to build something more than just a life. They were building a future. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack turned to Mary, pulling her close. "We've made it through the hardest part, haven't we?" Mary nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "We've made it through, and we'll make it through anything else that comes our way." With that, they stood together side by side, watching the stars appear above the land they had worked so hard to preserve. They didn't know what the future held, but in that moment they knew one thing for sure. Whatever came, they would face it together.